Hey, welcome to episode 138 of the Canadian Prepper Podcast. We're recording November 21st, 2021. My name is Eric. I'm host of the show based in Southern Ontario. I'm a hunter, target shooter, ham radio operator, and computer geek. As a first responder, I witnessed the over-reliance on emergency services during major events, and I started a small preparedness company to help people get better prepared for 72 hours, if not longer.
My name is Ian. I live on Vancouver Island. I'm a student in preparedness and hobby farmer.
I'm Scott, first responder splitting my time between Southern and Northern Ontario. I like learning things, and I don't accept that things will always carry on the way they have, just because that would be convenient for everyone, wouldn't it?
And I'm Jeff. I'm based in Central Ontario. I'm a target shooter, ham radio operator, and general overall handyman.
Hi guys, I'm Brad. I'm in Eastern Ontario. I've been in preparedness in some ways since the ice storm of '98, constantly trying to better myself as a part-time amateur prepper.
All right. We have with us tonight Dr. Arthur Bradley. He's an Army veteran, a father of four, avid shooter, and a dedicated homeschooler. He holds a doctorate in electrical engineering and currently works at NASA. Having lived all across the United States, Dr. Bradley writes from personal experience about preparing for a wide variety of disasters. He's been featured in the New York Times, Toronto Sun, Men's Journal, Costco Connection, and Popular Mechanics, and Money Magazine. Dr. Bradley is a well-known expert in EMP preparedness and has developed a set of unique protective products only available at disasterprepared.com. He's a prolific author, having written 17 books, including his handbook on practical disaster preparedness and a best-selling Survivalist series.
He may have written one more book in the interim since we wrote the blurb. Want to help support the show and keep the Canadian Prepper Podcast on the air? Buy some swag. We have both the Canadian Prepper Podcast t-shirt and the tactical Velcro patch at prepperpodcast.ca. All proceeds help keep the lights on and the backup generator and or wood gasifier fueled.
There it is, Kyle. 2 minutes, 21 seconds.
Just couldn't let it go, could you?
Too easy. Come on.
Yeah. If you're enjoying the show, please take a few minutes and like us on Facebook and submit a review on iTunes. Also, we want your feedback, good or bad, or if there's a topic you want us to cover, you can email us at feedback@prepperpodcast.ca.
So we've got some shielded content for you in this episode. We're going to start off with some recent news articles. We're going to let you know what we've done for our preparedness since the last episode. Then we're going to get into the main topic, EMP questions with Dr. Bradley. So let's move into the news.
So I don't know if anybody's noticed, but there was some flooding in BC.
Oh, really?
Noticed? Yeah.
Seriously.
Never
Yes,
paid attention.
In case you were living under a rock, yes, we had a, I think they called it an atmospheric river. I guess they can't call it the Pineapple Express anymore because it's probably offensive to pineapples or something. Typical winter storm, but it's a little heavier than usual. I think we ended up getting over a foot in a day of rain. And then we also had, obviously, pretty much continuous rain for about a month before that. And a couple of days of rain after that. And we actually have rain forecasted tomorrow. Long story short, washed out every major highway going in and out of the city of Vancouver. So with the exception of the U.S. border, there's literally no way to physically leave Vancouver right now, which is our second largest city in Canada, of course. Island itself here, where I am, has been cut off in two places along the only road up and down the highway, or only highway up and down the island, should I say. So we're having problems getting a lot of supplies as well. We actually had a fuel truck get a police escort to get to the fuel stations in Victoria because people have emptied those out real fast. We've had some stores getting emptied out with Costco. Let's see here. What was going on? Oh, yeah, I guess there's what was a drained lake back in the 1920s became a lake again, which happens to contain the dairy farms for half of BC's dairy products. And I think 90% of it's hothouse stuff, like the hothouse peppers and stuff, and dairy and what was the other thing? Poultry, yeah, I guess poultry production. So there's, I think, 50 to 60% of the province's poultry production is offline as well. And if that wasn't bad enough, because they can't get feed in, anything that's still there either has to get euthanized or used up real fast because they can't feed it anymore after a few days. Because generally, I think most of these places only keep about 3 to 5 days of food on hand at the farms. So fun times all around.
Sounds like it. And you're
Yeah.
sitting back just relaxing.
Yeah, actually, it's kind of funny. I was mentioning to the guys before the show. So, I mean, life hasn't really changed for us very much. So we've noticed that there's a 30 liter per day gas limit for, I guess, per visit, but it's never totally unenforceable. And they also have a 3-bag feed limit right now at the stores. But I mean, again, you could probably just show up 10 times in a day and still get 3 bags every time. So I don't know. But because we already had stuff here, we haven't been running around getting a bunch of stuff. But yeah, it's obviously it's a textbook preparedness scenario. I think Carmen and Kelowna was running into the same problem. I guess with the grocery stores running out because their highways were cut off as well for a while. But I think they've got one access point back now. And I think we may have one that's for emergency use only now on the north arrival. But it's like a 2-lane, really windy highway. So I can't imagine it's going to supply, 3.5 million people's worth of stuff. But yeah, we'll see. Yeah. So that's my news.
All right, I've got an article in here just from November the 17th. The public emergency alert system was tested. So if you had your phone go off, it's working. And if you didn't, maybe get it checked.
Was one of those really loud ones?
Yeah, the big
was.
loud alert. For here, it said there's nothing to be worried about, nothing going on. So naturally, I thought there was something to worry about, and obviously something going on. But
Yeah, not like the accidental nuclear one there a couple years ago.
oh yeah, that was interesting.
Yeah. So I've only really got one just for anybody who's in or around central Ontario. There is a snow squall warning in effect. They're talking about upwards of 40 centimeters in the next day to day and a half. So it's going to be the first snowfall of the year. Obviously, temperatures aren't cold. It's going to be heavy, wet snow. So there's going to be chances for power outages, tree limbs down, whatever. So that's it. That's it for me. I'm letting BC handle it.
All right, so let's move on to what we've done lately for preps.
So I've just been hunkering down, last preparation outside, getting ready for winter. I met up with Alan a week and a bit ago before he sadly succumbed to CO poisoning. He will be missed.
He'll be back next week.
He's a tough guy.
Yeah.
Was he doing yoga classes for like his calendar shoot prep or something like that tonight?
Something like that, yeah. He's getting all ready for a calendar shoot. That's what I heard, yeah.
Oh boy. I happily obtained 5 used generators this weekend. I'm looking them over the next week or so to see if I can't get them running. I have a feeling I can get 2 of them running pretty quickly. The others will go with the other 2 that I've already got that'll go to the repair shop if needed. Did some gas rotation, more cleaning in my basement where I am now, getting ready to do an additional room in my basement for my son, and then work and more work. That's it.
And just as I mentioned with the impending snow coming in, I topped off my truck with fuel and rotated a bit of fuel, made sure all my cans were topped off in case required for the generator. And that's all I've done this week.
Well, the fence saga continues here. I had a friend come by and evaluate what I had done, and we promptly tore it all down and started again. So the post stayed, but everything else, needed to be leveled out a little bit. So learning lots that way and figuring out how I messed up and how I can do better for the next time. And beyond that, I'm just continuing to grow the wonderful stash here for Movember. So starting to look a little creepy, but that's okay.
It's glorious. Come on.
Hey, it's for a good cause. So
that's right. As for myself, been basically putting my preps to work. So some practical application of stuff. I did actually dig a ditch for drainage about a week before that big rainstorm. So as luck would have it, the drainage ditch turned into a nice little river. So besides a bunch of rocks getting washed down the driveway, the drainage was good, kept the house dry. We also had a sump pump for backup, so it worked out well. Survived the heaviest rainfall I've seen here yet. So that's good. Mostly been doing recon work with the wife. We've been running around just kind of seeing how everybody else is reacting and kind of getting a general mood of the island right now. Some guy described it to me as Schadenfreude, which is taking joy in the misery of others. But I'll just call it recon work. But a couple things I actually noticed. First, one of the guys mentioned using a card lock system. So if there's ever a gas panic, that maybe if you have a card lock, you might have another crack at the gas before it all dries up. Turns out that the card lock place actually emptied out first, which is a bit of a surprise. So it kind of dings a hole in one of my backup plans. But yeah.
Probably everybody else had the same idea you did. Oh, yeah, there'll be lots of gas. I'll go and fill up. And
well, yeah, and the card lock, of course, it's open 24 hours, unlike the regular gas stations, which also is a bad thing, I suppose, too, when you think about it. And with that 30-liter limit, I mean, every time I do go out to drop off the daughter at work or whatever, I just make sure the tanks are still topped up. So the half tank rule has turned into like a 90% rule on the gas tank, just because at the rate we're going, we're probably going to be out of gas probably in a couple days here, at least for a short term. So I'm just making sure everything stays full. So the other thing that's really affected us here with the preps, I guess, is I've had to adjust to no EPS is delivering to the island, no Canada Post, air mail only. So if it can be flown into Vancouver, I can probably get it, but that's about it. But AliExpress is still great because it comes in from China and onto the West Coast here, which I have to mention is hampering the CGN deals a lot. But that's about the biggest thing. So as far as preps go,
that can't be going over well.
No, what are you going to talk about next week?
I did sell something to a guy further up island, so I was able to maintain doing CGN deals. But
okay. Fair enough.
That's it for me.
All right. Well, how about we move into the main topic then? Before we do that, though, a quick disclaimer. This is not formal engineering advice. This is entertainment and things to think about. So please use this information responsibly.
Dr. Bradley's YouTube videos under the EMP Doctor have frequently been used as a reference for this podcast. So we reached out and figured we'd ask him to join us. We've discussed the topic before, but it's really nice having access to an expert. His website, the disasterpreparer.com, has all kinds of products that he's developed, and his videos show him actually testing them. With detailed results. It's pretty cool. So we're looking forward to learning about EMPs and solar storms. Welcome, Dr. Bradley.
Thanks for having me on.
So we'll start out with just some information on EMP and solar storm, and we'll go from there.
All right, sounds good. So you want to lead the discussion of which areas we go in, or you want me to start from the beginning? Or how do you want to do it?
You know what? Can you start from the beginning, and then we'll jump in as some questions arise?
Sure. Yeah, I usually like to start by sort of talking about the differences between an electromagnetic pulse attack, which is an EMP, or like a solar storm, which is a collective term for a whole bunch of different solar events. So I'll start with the solar storm first because it's a little bit easier, I think, to follow for folks. And I'm not a sun expert. I work with some at NASA, but usually I seek out counsel whenever I'm unsure about things. But the gist of it is that, of course, our sun periodically likes to emit radiation as well as big coronal mass ejections, which are basically charged plasma particles that come toward the Earth, or they may head off in other directions if we're lucky. But the ones that come towards the Earth can have they can cause some disturbances for our planet. So solar flares, which you have heard about just recently, there was a big solar flare, typically cause things like interfering with radio communications or interference with GPS. Sometimes they can cause hazards to astronauts and people in high altitudes. But more importantly, for what I think most preppers worry about, is the things that can follow after the solar flares, which are called coronal mass ejections, or CMEs. And you hear people talk a lot about CMEs. Now, CMEs don't travel at the speed of light, unlike solar flares. So you never really know a solar flare is going to hit you until it hits you. And then you can watch it afterward because your radio broadcasts essentially come at the same speed as the flare. But you do know that CMEs are coming. They typically maybe travel at 1 million miles an hour or something like that. So they take a few days, maybe 2 to 3 days to get to Earth. So we see them coming. And basically this big plasma washes over the Earth and it perturbates our magnetic field lines, and it can induce currents in very long conductors on the surface of the planet. And those currents that are introduced into these long conductors can cause all kinds of problems. The biggest worry from them is that they'll take down our electrical grid and perhaps even cause damage to some of the transformers that are part of the systems. And if that happens, then you can all end up with all kind of problems. We can talk about some of the cases that have happened historically. But big CMEs are a thing, a real thing. They don't happen too often. Enormous ones hit the Earth about every 150 years or so. Unfortunately, we're just past that time from the last really big CME that hit the Earth, which is something called the Carrington event. But so anyway, these big plasma clouds wash over the Earth, cause all kinds of disturbances. And if you're really unlucky, they can cause damage to the power grid, which can really trickle down to all the other infrastructures in a country. So they're a big deal. And we can talk about how to prepare for them and that sort of thing in a few minutes. So comparing those to EMPs, there's a lot of similarity. So an EMP, electromagnetic pulse, is something that results when you detonate a weapon high in the atmosphere. And by high, I mean from 100 to maybe 300 miles up in the atmosphere. So very, very high. When you detonate something up that high, you don't have any sound that you'd hear down on the surface, and you probably wouldn't even see it unless you knew where you were looking. But what it does do is it essentially the gamma rays emitted from the explosion, they go out and they ionize the atmospheric molecules. And that just means they strip off electrons off of the atmospheric molecules. And those electrons then circle around the magnetic field lines of the Earth, and they perturbate the magnetic field, very similar to kind of what a CME might do. And they have similar effects. They can introduce currents into very long conductors, which can, again, affect the power grid. But it also has a very fast transient component to it that can couple electromagnetic energy into very small electronics, even things as small as your cell phone, your vehicles, things like that, unlike a CME, which does not do that. So EMPs are like the worst case. You get the bad stuff that was very similar to a solar event, but then you also get this really transient pulse energy that can damage anything you can just about think of in one way or another. And they don't have to be connected to very long conductors. They can be damaged even freestanding. So these are threats people worry about, and there's different techniques you can do to prepare for them. And we can kind of talk about those as we go forward. All that makes sense?
Absolutely.
Okay.
Quick question actually with the we talked about the antenna link. So with a CME, you're gonna have like long receptors like power lines and stuff to absorb the energy. And with an EMP, a quick side question for you, I guess, is you mentioned something as small as cell phones being affected. That's despite the short antenna length as well. Is that also because of the sensitivity of electronics, or is just even with the short antenna length, they're still going to get affected?
Yeah, no, it's a very good question. You don't need for an EMP, you really don't need conductors more than just a couple of inches, maybe, to pick up the energy fairly efficiently. And so cell phones fall into that range. But the reason cell phones are really susceptible is, like you said, they have very sensitive receiving circuitry in them. I mean, that's their purpose, right? Is to get the whispers of RF energy that are being transmitted around and not lose signal while you're talking to somebody. So they're meant to pick up very faint RF energy. And then all of a sudden, if they get blasted with a really powerful RF wave, they can easily get blown out. That's true of any radio system, really, that's operating in RF like that. Since they're so tuned into RF energy, receiving it, they can receive the EMP energy very well, typically, and they can be damaged quite easily. So cell phones and two-way radios, ham radios, things like that are all pretty susceptible when it comes to an EMP.
And even something as small as an LED, like so for small flashlights or anything that's just even that small as well.
Well, it's possible if the LED was connected into a circuit that had several inches of wire to it, it's possible that it could be damaged. If it was just freestanding, like you took a bunch of LEDs and scattered them out on the table, I don't think there's any way they would be damaged. So it has to have some form of closed loop circuit around it to be damaged.
Excellent. Thank you. That was one of those things that bugged me for at what point the antenna length becomes kind of irrelevant. But anyway.
Yeah.
Awesome. Well, you guys carry on with your questions first. I got someone later on here.
So, Dr. Bradley, in your book, EMP Attacks and Solar Storms, or Disaster Preparedness for EMP Attacks and Solar Storms, you also discuss building Faraday boxes. That's obviously something of interest to the prepper community. What is your advice for building an effective Faraday box?
Yeah, so there's a lot of misinformation about Faraday cages, so hopefully I can dispel a little bit of it. I'm going to start with the very basics. So any Faraday box or Faraday cage is just a conductive enclosure. The shape of it doesn't really matter. All that matters is that it's sealed up tight. a perfect Faraday cage is an unbroken box of some sort, or an unbroken sphere that's made of metal. It does not have to be grounded. There's a lot of misinformation about that. And there are lots of good reasons to ground things, electrical reasons. Lightning, where you can shunt away lightning, or for shock protection. There's a lot of good reasons to ground things. But when you come to small Faraday cages, like we're talking about here, and you're trying to protect from very high frequency RF energy that's something called in the far field, meaning it's from a long ways away with respect to its wavelength, it doesn't really matter if it's grounded or not, because it's just acting as a shielding barrier, and it will act that way whether it's grounded or not. So the good news is, if you cage, you don't have to drive down a big grounding rod and attach it to it. I do a video where I show it doesn't really make any difference at all whether they're grounded. So what you do want to pay attention to are the holes in the seams, as you'd imagine. So a lot of people build ad hoc Faraday cages out of galvanized garbage cans, metal garbage cans, and they're great. They work very well. You have a big metal can lid that you can take off, and you stuff your stuff down in there. A lot of people will line the inside of any Faraday cage with something non-conductive because they might be worried about the antennas or something touching the interior of the can. So that's a good, if what you're putting in has exposed metal, to go ahead and line it with cardboard or something. And then when you seal it up, you want to make sure that, especially around the door or the lid, that seam is really well sealed up. So a cheap way of doing it is to get one of those big garbage cans, put the lid on, then just take a big strip of like aluminum duct tape and put around the seam where the lid meets the can. And that works great. You can get 80 dB, 70, 80 dB easy out of a garbage can doing that. So keep that in perspective. 60 dB of shielding is 99.9% of the field is reduced. 80 dB is 99.99% of field reduced. So a lot of reduction of the signal and of the RF energy. So any of those work very well. Ammo cans, people do the same thing. But again, you want to pay attention to that long seam that goes around either the door, the hatch, the lid, whatever it is. It's an interesting experiment. A lot of people really worry about the pinhole kind of things in their Faraday cage, and that's not really what gets you. You can do an interesting experiment. You can make a Faraday cage shielding, and then take a small drill bit and drill a few holes in it, and the shielding will change hardly none at all. You'll keep almost all the shielding that you had. But if you take a knife and you slice a 2 or 3 inch slice in it, a narrow slice, the shielding might go close to zero, which would be no reduction of energy. And the reason is that those long narrow seams or cuts act as something called a slot antenna, which is a very efficient antenna to bring in energy. So what I always tell people is, if you're making a Faraday cage, it doesn't really matter if you wrap a box in aluminum foil or you buy a big garbage can or whatever it is. Don't worry so much about the tiny holes, but definitely worry about the long narrow seams. And so one way to handle that is to get conductive gaskets. We have some at disasterprepare.com, but you can get them other places. And you put those metal gaskets around the lid, and that helps it seal up nice and tight. So again, long narrow seams are what's important. Doesn't matter what metal you use. People wonder, is aluminum or copper or silver? The conductiveness of all of those metals is so good that the benefit of using silver over copper or copper over aluminum difference in practice. So that's good news. You can use the cheap stuff.
So is it important around the seams where you're putting the gasket to, say, if it's a painted box, to sand off the paint and have just a metal to metal on the seams?
Yeah, in theory, you'd think you'd have to do that. And in fact, I always used to do my ammo cans that way. I would grind off the very top of the ammo can before I put the gasket up in the lid. I grind inside the lid. But if you really run the tests and you don't do that, you don't go to that trouble, which introduces risks of like rust and things, you don't get much difference. And I think it's because it seals so tightly that the small layer of the gap thickness of the paint just isn't enough to allow the RF energy in. So my advice used to be always people, make sure you get metal to metal. But my advice now to people is, if you're worried, if there's some reason it's not easy to do that, like you're worried about corrosion and things, it probably won't make a bit of difference anyway. So that's my short answer on that.
Awesome. Actually, a quick question, just to back up to the beginning there as well. The minute you Google Faraday cage, of course, the first thing that originally pops up is something you see in a science center, and you see some kid in the steel box, and they're getting shocked, and of course, there's nothing wrong with them. And just for the listeners that were starting from scratch, So the difference between a Faraday cage and a science center versus like making an ammo can box is more of an RF energy thing than an actual just conduction of electricity, right?
Right. Yeah. Faraday cages have different uses. And one of them is to essentially form a protective interior, right? So you can have a Faraday cage around you and you have very high energy striking that Faraday cage and it gets shunted away. And those are grounded Faraday cages. So it gets shunted away to ground and you won't be affected inside, which is a good thing. But that's not really our purpose of a Faraday cage. Our purpose in this case is to block RF energy, as you said. And you'll notice those Faraday cages a lot of times are pretty coarse. They're mesh. They're not really trying to block RF energy, so they don't need a fine mesh or a solid metal. They might have something more like a chicken wire kind of spacing to it. Whereas if you're trying to block energy from an EMP, I did a video on YouTube where I build up a Faraday cage out of chicken wire and then I do one out of aluminum. And it makes a big difference. The one out of chicken wire might give you 10, 15 dB of shielding, and the one out of aluminum foil might give you 50 dB, which is a lot different. So it does make a big difference in terms of high frequency shielding. The rule of thumb is don't let any hole be larger than a millimeter. If all of the defects in your Faraday cage are a millimeter or smaller, then you'll have very good shielding.
Awesome. And just a quick question on testing them. Because of the different frequencies you're dealing with, different RF energy levels, what would be a good way to test to see if it's actually like functioning well? Like, can you try phoning yourself or can you try listening to a radio, or what would be a good test?
Yeah, there's not a great way. It's been asked for years, and people do cell phone tests, they do two-way radio tests, lots of different things. And none of them are really good tests, and there's reasons for that. Like, let's say, for example, you use your cell phone. You're like, well, I want to see if my cell phone rings, I know I got a crappy Faraday cage. Well, really true, because a cell phone runs perhaps at a different frequency. Plus, it's meant to pick up very sensitive RF energy, and you don't know something called its dynamic range, which is how small of a signal can it get versus how big of a signal can it get. So there's a lot of variables, how much signal's coming in from where I'm at. So it could be that you build a Faraday cage and you stick your phone in there and you seal it all up and the phone won't ring. And you're like, great. And then you build another Faraday cage that looks just like the first one, but your or maybe you have a different phone and you put it ring. And it really has to do with all those variables about signal strength and sensitivity of phones and stuff. So they're not really good tools to test. You don't have any idea if it blocks or doesn't block the cage is. And same goes for radios and other two-way radios are notoriously difficult to block. So I don't recommend that you try and block those with a Faraday cage. You'll only disappoint yourself because they might take 100 or 120 dB to block, which is very difficult. Now, if you build a Faraday cage and you put in a two-way radio and you can't talk to it from right outside, you've got a fantastic Faraday cage. That's about the only thing you'd know for sure. But most of them will not block a two-way radio signal. So how do you do it? Well, the only way I knew, I couldn't come up with a good way with a standard product. And so I designed a Faraday cage tester. And it's not cheap. It's, I don't know, a couple $100 or so, because it requires some components. And basically what you do is you use two-way radios, one inside of a shielded box, a very, very well shielded box. And inside that box is a button box attenuator, meaning a little RF dialable attenuator. You can change how much reducing the signal you put in. And then you put that inside the Faraday cage, and outside of the Faraday cage, you have another two-way radio with the antenna removed and a little stub antenna. So it's all kind of perfectly done. And then you can test by changing the values on that button box. You can figure out what is the shielding of my Faraday cage. And those are sold as a kit at disasterrepair.com. And it's the only way I know how. And you have to have patience and you have to be willing to take your time to use those kits carefully to really figure it out. But they do work. I did a number of videos on YouTube showing you how you put them together, how you use them. And I don't know of another way for a person without test equipment to check their Faraday cages. And I had a number of people when I first offered those. I don't know, we sold a couple hundred to people. And lots of people wrote me and said, I can't believe how bad my Faraday cage was. And they made subtle little changes, and we talked through email, and they made some subtle little changes to it and managed to get the shielding up significantly, maybe 20, 30 dB higher than it was when they had first tested it. So for those people, at least, it was a very worthwhile product because it helped them take their qualitative, it's a good cage, to a quantitative, it's a good cage. So that's the only way I know, unless you have, like I have RF test equipment at work, so I can use, antennas and amplifiers and things to test Faraday cages. But for low cost, that's the only way I know.
Well, having watched those videos where you're describing that process, it's lovely and elegant, and you're taking your multi-$1,000s worth of test equipment and mimicking the results in something really simple. I was looking at it and thinking, oh, I've got two-way radios. Why do I not just need the attenuator? But all the work you've done to calibrate it so that it's exactly 2 feet from your test.
Yeah.
You've sort of built this system to using all that calibration to mimic some very expensive test equipment.
Right. Yeah, that's the trick. You're right. I mean, you can build your own, don't get me wrong, but the trick was I used the really expensive equipment to verify my cheap equipment. I took measurements first with the really expensive, and then I calibrated the cheap stuff so that I would get the same numbers. And that's the trick. Unless you get, if you can get all the details the same, it'll work the same. There's nothing special about what I did. Get the same radios, the same button box, same, shielded box and stuff. But yeah, that's the whole deal, right? Is to make sure that you've verified that you are, in fact, what you're measuring is in fact right. So it took some time and some ingenuity to get it right. And I do tell people, if you buy one of those kits, you just go into it with some patience. I mean, it's like working on your car or something. Take your time and get some patience, because you're going to get frustrated with, why isn't it giving me what I think it should? Take your time, work through it. If you have questions, of course, you can write me and I can give you some thoughts on it. But it's an interesting experiment to really verify your Faraday cage.
It's been a question in the live chat here, just in regards to will unplugged solar panels survive an EMP without a Faraday cage?
Yeah, that question is asked a lot, and for good reason. So the short answer is, if the solar panels are freestanding, meaning they don't have any wires attached, then it's very likely they would survive an EMP. Now, a CME is not going to bother solar, because unless they're connected to very, very long conductors, they won't pick up enough energy. An EMP would and has damaged solar panels if they're connected to long. So if you have your system fully connected all the time, you're not going to go up and disconnect it, except for when you need it. Then what you could do is you can use some ferrites on the PV wires up at your panels. And that can help reduce the susceptibility of those panels. But the short answer is, if they're completely unplugged, they would probably survive without damage. And I'm not going to say 100%, but they would probably survive. Yeah.
I should just, since you mentioned it in the sentence there, could you just explain what a ferrite is to the average listener?
Sure. Yeah. Ferrites are essentially just ferrous materials with some very special properties. They're made out of special mixes of materials. And there are different kinds, but the kinds that I typically use in clip-on ferrites, which means if you have a cable, you clip them around the cable. And what they do is, as current flows down that wire, it generates a magnetic field around the wire. And the ferrite essentially concentrates that magnetic field in it. And when the current tries to change, like suddenly go up or suddenly go down, you have to change that magnetic field in the ferrite. And the ferrite's job is to resist the change in the magnetic field, the magnetic flux in it. And it does a good job of that. So it prevents very rapid changes in current and presses them through this magnetic field that it keeps inside of it. And so they help to suppress current transients that flow down wires. And if you clip it around your wires up at, then they would help to suppress those transients that would come in on those wires before they could do damage to your panels.
So kind of like a shock absorber and oleo for electronics.
Exactly right. That's a great example of it.
All right, we got another question here in the live chat from Kyle. He just wants to know what the biggest EMP myth is that you've heard of.
The ones I hear a lot are the grounding of the Faraday cage, which we talked about, and it doesn't matter even if I say you don't have to ground it, people will still believe that you do. And the other is that people have trouble discerning the threats of a CME versus an EMP. Again, a CME, an event from the sun, really only is a threat to things with really long conductors. Think mile longs, okay? Not your cars, not your freestanding electronics, nothing except for things with very, very long conductors. Whereas an EMP is a threat to basically everything in one way or another. And so what I tell people is, if you're prepared for an EMP, you got it in the bag, because you've got the CME sort of addressed. But I often get emails from people saying, hey, I'm worried about my car being affected by the solar storm that's coming. And then I have to explain to them, well, no, your car's not going to be affected by the solar storm because it's not connected to mile-long conductors. So you're okay with from that. So that's one of the big myths that people get confused about.
Awesome.
I guess along the lines of the myth, people have often talked about using a microwave as a field expedient Faraday cage. Can we talk about that?
Yeah, no, it's not a bad idea. For the EMP book, I tested a bunch of just standard things like a gun safe and a fire safe and a microwave oven. I tested a whole bunch of different things just to see how they did. And basically what I did is I generated a signal from test equipment. I put a receiving device inside and I measured what the levels were. And I could figure out what the shielding was. And microwaves do a pretty good job. They're not meant, they run at around 2.4 gigahertz. So they're not meant for the frequencies that we're dealing with here, but they still shield pretty well. They kind of don't do that great at the very highest frequencies of an EMP, like the 500 megahertz to a gigahertz or so, but they definitely do pretty well. And I wouldn't hesitate in a minute if I had nothing else of sticking stuff in it and closing the door. Very likely that would help anything in there to survive.
Awesome. Just Pierre, I guess he's talking more about bonding here than anything else versus a seam seal. But if you had a garbage can and attached a wired lid and then to the can, would that work? Like if you're bonding them electronically?
Well, bonding is a specific term in my world, so I'm not sure exactly what he means. Is he talking about like welding the two together, or?
I think just like having like a electrical lead attached to both, like versus a seal.
Oh, I see. Yeah, no, that wouldn't really do it. Because again, what you're worried about is that narrow gap acting as a slot antenna, bringing in information or bringing in energy. Even if you attach the two together, let's say you put a big metal strap between or lead between the two, it wouldn't change if you had an exposed seam or not. And so that energy could still get in there.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah. The cheapest way is just buy some aluminum duct tape and tape around it, but just wear some gloves because I've cut my fingers on that stuff so many times, taping and untaping Faraday cages, which is why I ended up getting those gaskets. I tested, I don't know how many, 30, 40 different size gaskets and found just the right ones for the galvanized cans. And you pay like $40, you get a couple of gaskets go inside. And it seems like a lot, but I'll tell you what, my fingers have thanked me ever since. It's just a much more elegant way to do it. You can take on and off the lid anytime you want. So
so we talked about Faraday cores. I guess other ways of mitigating the effects of CME, sorry, or EMP. Wow, that's pretty bad. Anyways, talk about ways of mitigating. You also have, besides Faraday cores, you have the traps and the shielding cloth. Can you explain those as well?
Sure. Yeah. So traps are recent. I developed, I guess it's been less than a year ago. And there's 3 different kinds. TRAP stands for Transient Reducing Auxiliary Plug. It's a mouthful. But basically what this was addressing vehicle protection is where it all started. Everybody wants to know, how do I protect my car from an EMP? Again, not a CME. We're not worried about that for vehicles, but an EMP. And there really was not a good way, to be honest, in my opinion. I couldn't find anything that would work. And because cars, for one thing, are extremely complex, right? They have hundreds of little microprocessors on them. They have cables going everywhere. It's a big spaghetti mesh of cables. So they're very difficult to come up with a general solution. And so the first thing I started with was, well, let's put them inside of some kind of a shielded enclosure. Well, that could be really expensive. But I tested, I guess, 25 different conductive cloths. And I found 2 that were pretty good. One was a little cheaper. So that's the one I ended on because it still ends up being quite expensive. And then I built this full-size cover to go over my vehicle, and I did some testing, and it does a pretty good job. It's enough that I think anything in my car would survive. I think the car would be drivable, no problem. The problem with the conductive cloth is only that it's very expensive. Even the cheapest that you can get, it might cost you $2,000, $3,000, $4,000 for a full-size cover for a vehicle. So it's definitely not cheap. And of course, the obvious drawback is you can't use it when you're driving, right? So it's only good when the car's parked somewhere, maybe overnight or something like that. So the limits are it's expensive and you can only use it some of the time. I will say that lots of people have bought them. We've offered them for a couple of years and people have bought them up. And they're all custom sewn, for a certain size vehicle you have to have made. But so I got to thinking, well, all right, what about when you're driving? How do you protect electronics? And I tried to approach it from a multi-point solution, which means I've got this big spaghetti mess of cables and processors. I cannot imagine a way in which I'm going to stick a device that's going to protect everything in all of the vehicle. I just couldn't figure out how to do that. So what I thought is, well, what if you had a few different devices spread around the vehicle that would all act to sync unwanted energy, transient energy. And that's where the trap was sort of developed to do that. And so what it does is it's a small device. It's only and you think, well, how could a small device absorb an EMP? Well, you have to remember these devices are only trying to shunt away the E1, really the E1 and a little bit of the E2 energy of an EMP, meaning the very, very brief time pulse energy. And if you do all the calculations, you find that there's not actually that much energy. It's the fact that it's compressed into nanoseconds is why it does so much damage. So what you need is you need a device that can take that energy, and these can, and that turns on like super fast, picosecond kind of turn on times. And so that's what the trap will do, is if it detects a transient in the vehicle harnesses or in the wiring, it will turn on and shunt that energy away before the voltage can rise very high. So you put one in every cigarette lighter plug you have, if you've got more than one. And there's another identical product that you can put across the battery, which is it's the same protective device. It's just in a different package. And then you can put some ferrites as well on the main cables, battery cables that go over to your primary fuse panel. They usually go from the battery to the primary fuse box. And those are the protections I have on my car. Those are the protections I recommend for folks, kind of a 3-step process. And to me, now, is it for sure going to make every car survive? No, it's not. Because if you're in the wrong place and all the energy lines up just right, and you have a very sensitive computer and the trap is a little too far away, it could still be damaged. But it gives you a much better chance of the vehicle surviving, even if it was upset and you had to shut it off and restart it, of it actually surviving. So that's been my approach, is using these traps. Folks can check them out. I don't know of anywhere else that has anything quite like that.
Yeah, that was the first time. Oh, go ahead, Scott.
No, I was going to say, just in speaking with you and the sales manager from the website, you guys will happily arrange shipping to Canada. So the website is in US dollars, and you'll email a shipping quote for any international clients, I believe is how it's phrased.
Yeah, I think so, unless they've added Canada shipping to the checkout. I think that's how they do it. And we've sold a lot of products up to Canada. Mm-hmm.
Excellent.
Somebody else has some questions as well?
Yeah, so my question was just in regards to testing the Faraday box, but you've gone over that in some pretty good detail. So that's the most popular question that I get presented with is, how do we test these? How do we know that they're going to work?
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
You went over in great detail there. So it's just a matter of getting the proper tools and doing a systematic test. And
right. Yeah. And people get confused. I don't go into a lot of detail in any of the documentation that I send out, but they get confused about what a dB is. You hear about, it's 50 dB or 60 or 80, and the button box is in dB. So, you dial in what you want to test. And let's say you want to see if it has 50 dB, you dial it in and then you check it. And a dB just stands for decibel, and it's just a ratio. And so what you're trying to see is the signal inside significantly smaller than the signal outside? And that's what that dB ratio tells you. So the number I've always told people is if you get 50 dB, which is 99.7% of the field reduced, you're doing great. And I don't think there's anything that you could put in your Faraday cage that would be damaged with 50 dB of shielding. The government, the military, if you look at their standards, we have a military EMP standard 188125 that it calls for 80 dB, which is 99.99%. But frankly, it's just a bit overkill. And we could go through the numbers, but you can take my word for it. If you get 50 dB or better, you've got a really good Faraday cage, and what you put in there, you should be confident would survive.
awesome.
Actually, you mentioned the government standard there for EMP protection as well. So since the EMP congressional report came out, and I don't think there's a whole lot done afterwards. I think they have the looking glass and the night watch airplanes kind of set up for EMP protection. But have governments around the world, I guess in general, paid more attention to it as of late, or has it been kind of one of those things that just put on the back burner because it doesn't buy votes?
Yeah, there's been some movement, but I don't know how much, and I don't know what's classified or not classified that I don't have access to. President Trump had formed a commission, or at least signed an executive order to look at EMP attacks. But But I was even on one of the review teams for some of that, but I haven't seen anything really come of it, to be honest. Most of the work in EMP nowadays would be done by computer. They would simulate over, lots of scenarios, fields and damages and levels and so forth. It used to be back in the old days, as you would, they built the big trestle station. You might know about that. It was a gigantic all wooden, it was called the trestle, but it was a big platform that even the screws and everything was wood. And so they would take military hardware onto this trestle and they would fire a giant EMP onto it and see what got damaged. And it was just so expensive that they eventually abandoned that. I think it's all mothballed now. And so everything now is done by computer. So even what I saw of the new look into EMP and the threats that it might pose to our grid and things like that, it looked like it was almost all going to be done by simulation. And then based on those results, maybe you would take action to harden certain things. But I haven't seen really any, true action come out of that yet.
And other than the odd Ocean's 11 movie or something like that, have you seen much in the way of actual EMP weapon usage or talk at all in the industry, or has there been much thought about using it as a tactical thing?
Yeah, there's been talk of it. I'm not in the military side of things, but certainly there's been some overt threats made. Russia, I think one of the ambassadors at one point, you could Google it, but they made an overt threat about an EMP strike on the US. North Korea has made some threats like that. Certainly China has EMP weapons capable of doing this. So it's a well-known, weapon that is at different countries' disposals. I mean, what you really need to initiate an EMP attack is you need a rocket that'll go high enough and carry a payload large enough, and you need a nuclear weapon. And some of them are even specially tuned where they generate lots more gamma rays, so you end up with a much more powerful EMP. So, our major adversaries out there, China and Russia in particular, they certainly have the capability to do it. And they have weapons on board that could do it. Now, would that be their primary mean of attack or their first means of attack? I don't know. There's lots of ways you can hit an enemy. But it is an interesting attack because it's an asymmetrical thing where you haven't killed anybody, right? And so if you bomb Los Angeles with a nuclear warhead, it's game on, right? Everybody's going to be throwing missiles everywhere, right? But if an EMP were to detonate over the eastern seaboard and all of a sudden power went out and people weren't sure what happened, but nobody's dead, there's not a giant crater, you get a different response and there's different confusions and things that happen then. So it's a different kind of weapon. I don't know if it would be a primary weapon for a major superpower, but it would certainly be something that we consider as a disrupting weapon, if nothing else. And terrorist nations, like a North Korea type thing, it would be, a beautiful, perfect weapon for them. They could do it in a way where they denied, that they ever did it. They could cause tremendous hardship on another country for fairly low cost, so it's a very asymmetric weapon. I think it's a real threat that people have to pay attention to.
Fair enough. I think that's all I had, Scott.
Recently, there was a G3 level solar storm described as a 1 in 100-year event. I've gone looking for any reports of damage and haven't seen any. How does it compare numerically to the 1989 Quebec power grid CME damage? Mm-hmm. Have you seen infrastructure improvements since then where the power system's actually taking it seriously? And sort of related to the G3 storm recently, we're entering a new solar peak cycle. How does it compare to historic averages?
Yeah. So we had a G3 storm. There was a lot of concern. It was first there was a big flare, which again hits us by about the time we know about it. And then we watched this coronal mass ejection come our way. And it's an interesting thing. You can tell how big it is. It's going to hit us. It looks powerful. But you never really know its effects. I asked some solar experts one day, their whole life is studying the sun and the effects of it on Earth. And they said it's an interesting thing that even when you know the size of the CME that's coming your way and everything, that's very, very difficult to predict what it's going to do. And oftentimes they don't know until minutes before it's happening. And so that's an interesting thing because I always thought, well, why don't they just bring down everything into a safe state, if they know it's coming? but they really don't know its effects. And the other point interesting is that even if the grid were brought down, it might not make any difference. The energy couples into the conductors all the same. You could still blow out things even if the grid wasn't powered. So, but as for your question, the G3 storm, yeah, as far as I could tell, didn't really cause any major damage anywhere that I could see either. The Quebec incident in 1989 was roughly like 500 minus 589 nanotesla. I think it's roughly twice what the G3 storm was in terms of its power. And of course, you know, there was some disruptions from that, short-lived, but still disruptions. So I think this event was a bit of a non-event, if you will. Nothing really happened from it. But again, it could have caused some damage. It depends on how it hits the earth and how it wraps around. And folks have explained it to me, but the short answer is there's a bit of randomness to it that nobody quite understands. But there is certainly a risk that a large CME, like the Carrington CME, which is much, much larger than like the Ontario one, that if you had an event like that hit the earth, the worry is that it would take out maybe the entire electrical grid of the United States. And, you know, all of the various subconnects all would get taken down. You'd blow out a bunch of heavy, big, giant room-sized transformers. And those transformers are very hard to replace. Not very many replacements around. They're built overseas. There's all kind of story to all this, where predictions are you might be without power for months or even up to a year, which would be horrible. I can't imagine what life would be in that amount of time. So the threat of a CME, a large CME like the Carrington event hitting the earth, is very real. It's going to happen, no doubt about it. Will it happen in my life? I don't know, but it's going to happen for sure. What's not known is what will the effect be, and no one knows that at this point. Roughly, they know, I think I mentioned this earlier, statistically, it's about every 150 years that you get a giant CME comes over the earth. And we're about 160 years from the Carrington event. So we're could happen tomorrow. We could see an eruption tomorrow that's coming our way, or it might not happen for another 50 years. But it is a certainty. It's not like an EMP where someone has to do something. It's going to happen. It's just a question of what effect it's going to have on us and when it happens. You ask about the solar cycle. So you guys know, I'm sure, but maybe some of your listeners don't. The sun is on an 11-year cycle, roughly 11 years. It changes each time, where every 11 years it switches its poles. So north and south switch positions, and which is an odd thing in its own right, but that happens. And you can end up with these solar maximums and solar minimums. And people think, well, during solar max, as we're accumulating and we're starting to switch, maybe we get more types, and when we're going to minimums, we get other types of events. But I looked into all that, and I'm not convinced. I think during any of them, solar cycle, anywhere you're at in the cycle, I think you can get a gigantic CME out and cause yourself lots of problems. So people who worry about, we're at the minimum and then we're going to get all kind of this kind of activity, or we're at a maximum, we're going to get this kind of activity, I don't think it matters so much. I think it could happen anytime. So I'm not sure that tracking that cycle really tells you a whole lot. It's much better to just keep up with some of these sun watching sites that tell you, even send you alerts when something happens, so you know what might be coming.
Okay. Recently, we were discussing an article about the susceptibility of very long fiber optic lines, not the fiber optics themselves, but the repeaters that are powered by copper or inductive lines, spaced every 100 kilometers or whatever under the ocean, them being vulnerable to CME and those giant long antennas to collect that energy. Along with the power grid, what other systems do you see as being particularly vulnerable to that CME energy, be it pipelines, fiber optic lines, the associated repeaters? What systems are most at risk?
Sure. Yeah, so it's like you said, those are the things that you worry about. Anything with control type systems where you have some little controller box somewhere every so often doing things. And a lot of our utilities use those SCADAs, they're called. And they did a bunch of tests as part of the EMP Commission. They tested and showed that a lot of those SCADAs can be damaged, those supervisory control systems. And so, yeah, any of those that have really long conductors, and then you have solid state electronics making decisions and switching things on and off, those are possible to get damaged. And that's what's going to take a lot of infrastructure type things, either from a CME or from an EMP, because both of those cases could couple energy into those. As worrisome as those are, all the control things that might be down, but you can change them out and bring them back up, through time. The bigger threat is to the grid itself, the power grid, because again, as I mentioned, some of the transformers, which are just used to change from one voltage to another voltage, if they get damaged, they're very difficult to repair or replace. And so you could be without power for much longer while you were trying to replace those things. There's also a lot of concern about like nuclear power plants. I wrote an article on that a couple of years back. I interviewed somebody running one of the power plants and asked them a lot of questions. Ends up they're pretty safe. They have a lot of safeguards, as you'd expect, about 4 levels, where if they lose power, there's immediate dead man, stops the fusion in the core, and there's all of these protections that they have. So I think they're probably okay in the short run if you had an EMP or a big CME, but it would be the long run. You have to keep those their rods, essentially their rods that go inside of those reactors. You have to keep them cool for years after they come out, for years and years. They're very hot and very radioactive, and so they put them in these giant pools of water, and especially controlled water. And if it gets too hot, it boils off the water and then it explodes, which is what happened at Fukushima. And so that's where the worry is that if you somehow lose power and you can't circulate the water in those pools anymore, you can end up having these explosions and throw nuclear contaminants everywhere, and that's a mess. So there's some risk, I think, with nuclear plants. But again, I don't want to throw any panic because there are a number of safeguards, and I think we would likely figure out a way to keep them safe, even in the event of a long-term blackout. It just would be challenging.
Okay. Speaking of long-term EMP type blackouts, in your book you mentioned 1 Second After, which we did a book club review here for a lot of our listeners. You also mentioned Lights Out. Both are fictional stories describing sort of the life of survivors after an EMP event. Both rely very heavily on that EMP report to Congress in terms of their research. What are your thoughts on those books and how likely or unlikely they are? The susceptibility of small electronics, is my Kobo reader long gone, or what are your thoughts on the validity of the fiction?
Well, I read 1 Second After. I haven't read Lights Out, so I can't comment on it. 1 Second After was just a depressing book, frankly. But
scariest thing I've ever read.
Yeah. Just a sad story. And I know it was written that way intentionally because it's not trying to glamorize life afterward. The only thing I took issue with was the essentially disabling all the vehicles. Data doesn't show that to be true. The likelihood is that if you had an EMP and you were in the affected area, maybe 15% of the cars would be permanently damaged. Many others would have issues and upsets and, all of that, but they might not be permanently damaged. And so in short order, many cars could be back and operational based on the data we have. So that was the only thing I really took issue with. Otherwise, it seemed pretty accurate. They were trying to capture, Dr. Fortune was trying to capture, I think, what life would be like and the hardships of trying to adapt and, medical issues if you needed electricity for, keeping insulin cool and things like that. So, they're good. I'm sure they're both good stories. I haven't read Lights Out, but, and it's good to get people thinking, in other than adventurous ways, like a lot of prepper fiction. And I wrote prepper fiction. I know, it's fun to gunfights and, action and all that, but it's also good to get people thinking practically about, well, what would the effects be and how might we ready ourselves for some of those realistic effects? So it's good. It's a good way to get some message out there. As for small electronics, from an EMP, certainly they could damage small electronics. The short answer is, the more sophisticated electronics it has in it, the more likely it is to be damaged. So if you have a motor, it's not going to be damaged. It's got heavy duty wire and it's meant to take current. Remember, this is a very brief in time event. But if you have, something with a solid state electronics control on it, damage and harm that very quickly. So solid state electronics are sort of the issue when you've got an EMP. They can get damaged pretty quickly. One interesting side note is a lot of people are worried about their gun safes. I know everybody's got a gun safe. Because a lot of the new gun safes have the digital locks on the front, and people are rightly worried, I think, that, oh crap, the EMP is going to take out my gun safe. I can't get into my guns right when I need them. And if you have a keyed backup, you're probably great. But if you don't, I always tell people you can always take aluminum foil and wrap it over the face of your gun safe's lock. That will give it some shielding protection. Some people even use conductive cloth and make like a little hat that goes over it. It's a pretty slick little thing. So that's a good piece of advice too if people have just those digital control locks.
Actually, just a side note, one listener is asking what you use as a math curriculum for your kids since you work for NASA.
Yeah. Well, I do teach. I'm the only class I teach to my kids is math. My wife teaches all the other, spelling and all that stuff. But I'm pretty solid on math. And so we went through a number of different things from Abeka to Sunlight, and they all have their advantages. And what we do is we typically use either Abeka or Sunlight up until grade 5. And then we switch over to conventional books by like Glencoe or McGraw-Hill. And I teach from those standard textbooks, just like I would, if I was a teacher in a school. We only do that because the quality of those products at those later grades is just so much better than the quality of homeschool materials. You just have lots and lots of better quality products with pictures and graphs and other things. So that's the way we teach it.
Excellent. Just to answer Susan's question as well, when I homeschooled my kids, for some of the stuff, if we had an online requirement, we use something called IXL or IXL math. And then also for outside the house stuff, we'd have a Kumon, the Kumon after school math and reading program. Worked out well for both of our kids. So that's what she's after that.
Okay. We've got another question in here from Denny. Just asking about what about like an all electric car? Is that something we should be worrying about, or what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, it's a good question. I get asked that routinely, and how to protect it, right? Because we're all kind of moving that direction. Before long, I think that'll be the bulk of cars sold. And the short answer is I don't know fully. You certainly can use the same protections that we already offer, which is the traps and the ferrites on your car, and it will offer some protection. But there's the big question about, well, what about that big rechargeable high voltage battery bank? Don't put a trap across that and just get burned up right away. So I don't know how you would protect that high voltage battery bank. And I don't know that you even need to, because I haven't had a chance to really study that. So it's kind of an incomplete picture at the moment. My best advice to folks is to treat it just as if you would a regular, any other gas marine car, and put the traps and the ferrites on it until we know more.
Okay, good to know.
So I've got a couple quick ones here. You did, one of my questions was your thoughts on vehicles surviving an EMP, and you say about 15% probably won't. I mean, there's all kinds of, as you say, different numbers out there. Everybody's got a different idea. I'm hearing anywhere from 75% won't survive to 15%. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, it's a hard thing to know definitively, and don't take my 15% as gospel for sure. It could be 10%, it could be 5%, it could be 20%. But the EMP Commission did some tests on vehicles, I think 50 some odd vehicles, and what they showed is that vehicles were pretty robust to electromagnetic energy. And you'd expect that, right? Because we have lightning strikes, hit, the tree near my house. My car doesn't all of a sudden, get damaged. It might have a weird flashing light for a moment, but they're meant to take very powerful electromagnetic energy nearby them. Same way if you drive by the broadcasting tower for a powerful radio station, your car doesn't all of a sudden just crap out. So they're meant to take energy like that without really dying. But with that said, they were able to upset the electronics in some of the cars, and so it's certainly possible. They also their tests were, many people criticized the vehicle tests that the commission did because their guidance was to not damage the vehicles. They didn't want to have 50 cars that are all destroyed and then have to pay to repair them. So my understanding is that they would turn up the field levels until they got a disruption in the vehicle, and then they would essentially call it, we don't go any higher, we don't want to blow the vehicle out. And so they showed there was some susceptibility, but they didn't take it to the point of failure on some of them. So it's a little unclear still. But I think, whatever number you want to believe, you can, but it would not be a scenario by which all the vehicles suddenly died, or the vast number of vehicles suddenly died. If a vehicle is operational, like you're driving it at the time, it's probably slightly more susceptible than if it's sitting idle, just because you have to build up the energy in the vehicle. But I will tell you this, it's a very serious picture either way, because if you can imagine being on an interstate and all of a sudden, let's say 1 out of every 4 cars suddenly stalled out, some of them are permanently damaged, some are just shut off, there would be massive catastrophes on the roadways of all sorts. And if that happened all over the country, there's no way to evacuate, pull those vehicles out. It would just be a giant log jam of vehicles and accidents of all sorts. So if you were on a roadway when something like that happened, especially like an interstate or something, it's very likely you wouldn't be able to drive out of that event anyway. Even if your car was running, you'd probably have to figure out another way to get out of there. So it would be a disaster, a true disaster. But it might not be for the reason people think. It might not be because every car died and you couldn't restart it. It might be more because of all of the accidents and the mayhem that ensued from so many cars having problems at one time. And keep in mind, most people don't know what an EMP is. They'd have no idea what happened. No one would know if we're being attacked by aliens or what was going on, right? So there would be a lot of confusion and I think a lot of mayhem, and it would be a very big problem, but maybe for reasons different than what people think.
Okay. Yeah, that's great. Thanks for that. And the next one I was sort of curious about is planes. I mean, planes, as we all well know, can withstand a direct lightning strike. Would they survive an EMP?
More than likely, yeah. I looked into this a bit, and I've been on a plane that was hit by a direct lightning strike. And I'll tell you, if you've never been on it, it scared the bejesus out of me, okay? Because you were sitting in the plane, all of a sudden the loud, thunderous boom, I thought gunshot went off. And maybe it was my imagination, but I swear I saw a little trickle of smoke go up through the cabin too. But anyway, it was very frightening. But you know what? The pilot got on about 30 seconds later and said, well, folks, we just got hit by lightning. And on we flew. It was not a catastrophic event. And airplanes, especially I'm talking commercial airliners, they are quad redundant systems, meaning they have 4 completely redundant systems on them. So one system goes out, they switch over to the backup, that goes out, that goes over to the next. They don't go down easy. Now, yes, you can take them down by blowing an engine off or something, but electronic wise, they're very robust, reliable pieces of equipment. So I don't think an EMP would take down many, I'm not going to say any, but I don't think it would take down many large commercial airlines. Possible? Yeah, it's possible. I just don't think it would happen much. The bigger issue might be that it might take out some of the facilities on the ground, which would then make landing all that much more tricky. And they do have lots of protocols for how to land, even without RF communication and all that kind of stuff. So I think they'd probably get the planes on the ground, but it would be a mess and it would be dicey. And sure, there could be problems where planes ran out of gas trying to get to the ground and all kinds of problems. But I don't think it where an EMP fires and all of a sudden, 500 planes go and crash. I don't know about little planes, those small planes. I just don't know how redundant they are compared to the modern airlines. Are just, I doubt they're as well shielded and as redundant, and so they might have more problems than some of the bigger planes.
I think with the small planes, though, at least they have a magneto-driven system. They don't require electronics to actually fire the spark plugs, so they might have a little bit of redundancy there.
Yep.
But anyway. Anybody else have any questions?
I do. I had a question about batteries inside a Faraday box. If I wanted to protect a battery inside the Faraday box, I know there's a diode you can use. It's like a switch, and this is the first I've ever heard of tonight, this ferrites. Would that work to protect a battery like a Life PO4 battery, like the iron phosphate or iron lithium phosphate, whatever they are? Would that protect one?
I don't know that it would. So the risk to batteries is, if you just have normal alkaline chemical type batteries, they're not a risk of being damaged by or CME, either one, unless they're inside of a piece of electronics, right? So, but if they're just sitting on the table, they're not going to be damaged. You don't have to put them in a Faraday cage or anything like that. But some batteries have these built-in charge control or battery monitoring systems in them. And those circuits are fairly sophisticated solid-state circuits that could be damaged. So you think about, well, if it's inherent to the battery module itself, how would you protect it? And really the only way I can think you could protect it is to essentially put it inside of a Faraday cage, which, and that would protect it from any kind of fields outside. But if wires through the Faraday cage, there's no better way to compromise your Faraday cage than to run a wire through it. So, if you had a battery in there and you thought, well, I'll use the battery, I'll put it in a Faraday cage to protect it. But now I'm going to run a wire out to go power X, Y, or Z out there. You've essentially completely compromised your Faraday cage. The energy will just come right in on the wire. And then you'd say, well, could we put a Faraday on the wire? Yeah, you could. Would it be enough to protect the battery? I don't know. I don't recommend putting any wires in or out of a Faraday cage. It's just very difficult to do properly. There are ways to do it, but you have to do it with filters, something more sophisticated than diodes. And those filters are expensive. People build, like at work, we have a big room. It's a big Faraday cage the size of a room. And it has filters on one wall where all the power comes through the filters to come in and power the room. And that's really the only way I know how to do it effectively.
All right. Thanks.
Mm-hmm.
Well, speaking of fiction with 1 second after and lights out, you have your own couple fiction series as well, don't you?
I do, yeah, and I'm proud of them. I started with nonfiction. I wrote my handbook, Practical Disaster Preparedness for the Family, sort of kept knowledge about preparedness at the time, and then went on to write a couple other nonfiction books. And then I thought, I really want to tell a story, so I started with a series called The Survivalist, which, as many people know, is the very famous name of a book series by Jerry Ahern, which I read when I was a kid, young teenager, and loved it. Still have all of the books. I have the whole set minus the first book. I don't remember how many there are now, 40 books or so, but there's a lot of them. And so anyway, the series is called The Survivalist. It's not in any way a taking off of Jerry Ahern's stories. It's for premises, not a nuclear around a pandemic. And it was before COVID, but a giant pandemic essentially hits the earth, goes across the earth due to a bio attack. And a lot of people are killed off. And the story is really an adventure story about a U.S. Marshal and his dog as they kind of wander what's left of the U.S., kind of fixing things and righting wrongs. It's kind of a two-sided story. You have him and his dog doing their thing, and you have his father, who's an ex-con. He escapes from prison, and he's kind of out doing his thing. And they're very, very different people with very different moralities and willingness of what drives them, what they're willing to do to people. And it's meant to show, a lot of it's just action, gunfights and other fun things, but it's kind of meant to show the two sides that I know a lot of people in the prepper community, survivalist community have. On the one side, people are sort of that hardcore, I'll do what I have to do to make it. And then on the other side, people want to be kind of the noble cause. And so that's sort of what the two sides are, where the convict is sort of, he'll do whatever it takes. And he's not a bad guy, but he does things that could be called bad. And then there's this sort of noble marshal that tries to live right by everybody. And it's an interesting, it was an interesting paradigm. There's 12 books in the series, and it's, it's sort of complete story arc over those 12 books. And it was an interesting thing for me to kind of develop and think about those two sides and how the world, they're going to be competing as you try and survive in a really difficult spot like that. So it's a fun series. Like I said, lots of gunfights. There's even some sort of mutated things that go around they have to kill and stuff. It's kind of people compare it to a cross between The Walking Dead and Justified, if you know Justified series, Timothy Oliphant series. So anyway, that was my survival series. Been very well received by folks. It's a lot of fun. Books, check out the audiobooks. They're great to listen to, in my opinion. And then the other one I did, the other fiction book, there's only one out. It's called The Watchmen, and it's completely different. It's set in the 1890s. It's about a guy that gets recruited by the president, essentially to join a small group of elite people in the country who are trying to investigate paranormal happenings across the early United States. And it's a fun story too. It's just a different setting. And so I had a lot of fun writing that too.
That's awesome. Yeah, for years I had the disaster preparedness book sitting on my cell phone, and then I heard about the Survivalist series. I started that last week, just as the same day that Merck would discover those vials of smallpox in their freezer. I was like, oh, how apropos! So excellent series. I finished book 1 already, so I'm into book 2. So yeah, well done. It's
great, thank you.
Very enjoyable read.
Appreciate it.
And are we able to find those on Amazon, or is there somewhere specific we can look for the books?
You can look on anywhere, really. You can just search The Survivalist by Arthur Bradley. Most people buy them on Amazon. You can buy them at disasterpreparer.com as well. Might save a couple of bucks if you're getting paperbacks. But I think all of the digital copies are either Amazon or Barnes & Noble, maybe Apple Books.
And I put
Awesome.
the links to the author page and his book at the bottom of the show notes for the listeners. They can, I'll put the links in the chat as well, and make sure they can access them.
Awesome. All right. Do you have any other questions? All right. Well, thank you, Dr. Bradley. That's been some fantastic information, and you've certainly helped clarify a few of the myths and a few of the questions that we get quite a bit from listeners in regards to EMP and Faraday boxes. So that's been a great help. I appreciate you taking some time out of your evening to answer some questions for us.
Sure. Yeah. Thanks for having me on. It's been a pleasure.
Okay, should we move into the podcast challenge?
So next week's topic, what are you going to pack in your Faraday box? This week's challenge, plan what you're going to pack and share it with a group. Please let us know via either feedback@prepperpodcast.ca or in the Discord group. I'm planning on packing all the things Dr. Bradley suggests and stealing credit for it. Please share your ideas to help us all feel a little more prepared.
All right, and some upcoming events.
So what's yours, Eric?
You'd think I'd read the show notes. So December 4th and 5th, we've got map reading and land nav course by Ragnarok Tactical. It's going to be held in Mississauga, Ontario. So the link will be in the show notes. So get on out there if you can and learn how to read some maps and navigate your way around.
And spend time with Andrew and Gavin from Canadian Patriot Podcast. So, deal of the week, I've got a deal on, as luck would have it, ammo cans, both poly and steel.
Huh.
So Princess Auto has a sale on both of those currently right now. With the plastic ones, you can use for your solar battery power banks type of thing if you want to play with those. Metal ones if you want to do some EMP shielding. So check out the links.
All right, let's move into some shout outs. So again, just another quick shout out to Dr. Bradley for coming out and sharing all of your knowledge with us. We do appreciate it.
I'd like to give a shout out to the Island Mentor once again. Gave me some quad help with my starter, which actually happened to do with coil theory and electronics. So that was a good learning lesson this week again. So thanks a lot.
I want to shout out my buddy who is here helping me this past week. Got a bunch of stuff done around the house.
Did you get that wood stove installed yet?
Shh, that's a secret.
Yeah, you can't say that too loud, Jeff.
Not anymore.
All right, let's move into some email and iTunes reviews, shall we? So we've got a new Patreon, Pam K. So thanks for signing up for $5. We appreciate it.
Awesome. I've got a email from Buddy. Literally, that's his name. It says, "Hi guys, I've been listening to your show and greatly enjoy doing so. Like you guys, I'm actively shooting in the shooting world. I'm a hunter and I served in the military. On the side, I own a company that builds knives and jewelry as well as carpentry projects. And it occurred to me that, to my knowledge, you guys have not talked about tool development and fabrication thereof. That would be a fun chat to have." That's from Buddy.
That would be a fun chat to have.
Yeah, making your own knives and stuff like that would be kind of a cool subject. So if Buddy wants to come on, he's more than welcome.
Absolutely.
Because I don't know enough about it to talk about it. So,
no. All right. Well, with that, I'll bring episode number 138 of the Canadian Prepper Podcast to an end. You can find the podcast on iTunes, Podbean, Spotify, or of course your favorite podcast app. Please help us out. Submit a review. It does help other people find us.
We record these shows live on Facebook and YouTube. If you want an early peek at the shows, please subscribe to the YouTube channel, Canadian Prepper Podcast, and click the notifications tab. That gives you alerts when we're going live. You can contact me at feedback@prepperpodcast.ca, and if you're looking for Alan, it's Alan with one L.
And you can find me as well at feedback@prepperpodcast.ca.
I can be reached at monkman038@gmail.com.
hey, if you want to get a hold of Dr. Bradley, you can go to his website, disasterprepare.com, and also on YouTube. His YouTube channel name is EMP Doctor. As for myself, you can reach Ian directly by emailing me at theislandretreat@gmail.com. And you can also find me on Canadian Patriot Podcast, which is on iTunes and YouTube. We record Monday evenings at 9 p.m. Eastern as well. I'm also on the Discord group for both CPPs. Email us if you want an invite to those. There you can find us discussing why government waste and society has me circling back to the merits of tinfoil hats.
All right, then please check out Rapid Survival at rapidsurvival.com. You can get me there on the live chat. You can also email me at feedback@prepperpodcast.ca. So thanks for joining us this evening. Until next time, be prepared, stay safe,
And keep learning.